The evening was cold, and the city streets were busy with lights and laughter. Inside the grand hall, people in fine clothes sat at polished tables, eating warm meals and drinking sweet wine. Their voices were loud, their smiles bright, and the smell of food filled the room like a heavy blanket. No one noticed the thin girl who stood quietly at the door. Her dress was old and torn, her shoes worn out, and her face pale from hunger. She pressed her hands to her stomach as it growled, but she didn't step back. She looked at the shining piano in the corner of the hall, its black surface glowing under the golden lights. Her eyes stayed on it as if it was her last hope. She was small compared to the crowd, and people brushed past her without care. A waiter frowned and asked her to leave, but she whispered softly, almost too soft to hear, "Please, can I play your piano for a piece of bread?" The waiter blinked, not sure what he heard, and then laughed as if it was the funniest thing. A few guests near the door overheard her words, and soon the laughter spread. A man in a dark suit raised his glass and said loudly, "The beggar girl wants to play for bread, shall we let her?" The crowd chuckled, some shaking their heads, others smirking as if it was a joke too good to miss. But the girl did not laugh. She stood still, her hands trembling, her lips dry. She had not eaten since morning, and even then it was only a small piece of stale crust she found on the street. The smell of roasted meat and fresh bread from the tables almost made her dizzy, but she kept her eyes on the piano. She did not care about the laughter. She only thought of the sound of keys under her fingers, the only thing that made her forget her hunger. A young woman in a golden dress leaned toward her friends and whispered loud enough for the girl to hear. Maybe she should wash the dishes instead. That will earn her bread, the others giggled. Some said she was crazy, others called her bold, one man mocked. If she touches the piano, it will break. But inside, the girl's heart beat faster. Not from fear, but from a strange fire that grew stronger with every cruel word. She stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the polished floor. The waiter moved to block her, but the man in the dark suit raised his hand. "Let her try," he said with a smirk. "It will be good entertainment." The crowd clapped mockingly as if they were watching a circus show. The girl's cheeks burned, but she did not look at them. She walked straight to the piano, her small fingers brushing against the smooth surface. Her reflection stared back at her from the shiny black wood. Thin face, tired eyes, hair falling loose around her shoulders. She almost did not recognize herself. Her hands trembled as she sat on the piano bench. The crowd leaned forward. Waiting to laugh again, a waiter whispered, "This will be embarrassing." A child giggled, pointing at her dirty dress. The girl closed her eyes, breathing slowly. She remembered the small old piano in her neighbor's house, the one she used to play whenever they allowed her. She remembered the nights when she pressed the keys alone in the dark, creating music that carried her pain away. That memory gave her strength. She whispered again, almost to herself, "Just one piece of bread." Her fingers touched the first key. The sound was soft, almost hidden under the noise of the hall, but it was enough to make a few people turn their heads. She pressed another, then another. Her hands found the rhythm, and though the crowd still whispered and chuckled, she felt the world around her disappear. At the door, a guard crossed his arms and muttered, "This is foolish," but even he leaned closer. The man in the dark suit lifted his brows, waiting for the joke to unfold. Yet inside the girl's chest, the music had already begun to grow. She ignored the smell of food, the empty ache in her stomach, the laughter that stabbed like knives. For her, only the piano existed now in that moment. She was not a beggar asking for bread. She was not a girl in torn clothes. She was only a player, a dreamer, a soul reaching out through music. And though the crowd did not yet know it, they were about to be silenced in a way they never expected. The sound of the first few notes still floated in the air, but the hall did not fall quiet yet. Instead, the laughter grew louder, as if the crowd wanted to crush the little bit of courage she had. A man at the corner table clapped slowly in mockery and said, "Look at her. She thinks she's a musician." His friends burst out laughing. One woman with pearls around her neck shook her head and said, "She doesn't belong here. This is not a place for street beggars." The words stung, but the girl's hands stayed on the keys, trembling, searching for strength. The waiter who had first tried to stop her leaned closer and whispered to the guests, "She only wants bread, that's all. She will embarrass herself in a moment." More chuckles followed. Another man raised his voice. "Why not give her a broom instead of a piano? She can sweep for her supper." The cruel jokes rolled through the room like fire. The girl lowered her eyes, but she did not move away. Something deep inside her pushed back against the humiliation. Something stronger than her hunger. She pressed another key, then another, trying to block out the voices. But one young boy near the front table shouted, "She's too dirty. The piano will need washing after this." His parents laughed along. The girl bit her lip, her chest heavy with shame. Her thin shoulders shook, and for a moment she thought she should stand up and run. She thought maybe they were right. Maybe she was foolish to believe they would give her a chance. But then her gaze fell again on the breadbasket at the edge of the table, golden crusts, soft white insides, and she remembered why she was here. The man in the dark suit, the one who had first encouraged the mockery, raised his glass again and said loudly, "Let her play. Let us hear this masterpiece of the hungry girl." His words carried across the room, and the laughter spread once more. But his smirk only fueled the fire inside her. She straightened her back and touched the keys again. This time she pressed them harder, stronger, as if each sound was her answer to their cruelty. A few guests noticed the change. They leaned back, surprised by the sudden confidence in her hands. The music was not yet a song, but the strength in the notes carried something. The laughter softened in one corner, but in another, a woman covered her smile with a napkin and said, "She should stop before she embarrasses herself further." The girl heard it, every word carving into her heart. But instead of breaking, it made her push forward. Her fingers started to move faster, still shaky but filled with determination. The crowd had expected her to fail at the first note, to break down in tears. Instead, she pressed on, fighting with every sound. Some still laughed. Others leaned forward, confused. She was not playing like a professional yet, but there was something in her stubbornness, something in the way she refused to let go that unsettled them. The waiter who had mocked her earlier crossed his arms and muttered, "This is pointless," but he did not stop watching. The child who had teased her grew quiet, his eyes fixed on her hands. The girl kept her eyes down, ignoring the crowd. She thought of her little brother at home, waiting for food, his face pale with hunger. She thought of her mother, sick and weak, who once told her that music was a gift that could not be taken away. Those memories gave her strength. One man tried to break the silence forming by clapping his hands again. "Enough, little beggar. Go home." But his voice was weaker now, not as sure as before, because in his heart he knew she was not stopping. She did not hear him anymore. She only heard the piano, her tears almost spilled. But she blinked them away. She would not let them see her cry. Not now. Her hands grew steadier, the sound sharper, clearer. The laughter that had filled the hall like thunder was beginning to fade. People looked at each other, wondering what was happening. It was no longer funny, it was no longer a show. Something was beginning to change in the air. The man in the dark suit leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading slightly. He had wanted a joke, a moment of fun at her expense, but now he watched with narrowed eyes, unsure if he was still in control of the moment. The girl pressed the final note of her first attempt, and the sound lingered. For a second. The room was still. Then one man coughed awkwardly, a woman adjusted her dress, and the mocking laughter returned. Weaker than before, but inside the girl something had woken up. She realized she could silence them, not with words, but with music. She had only shown them a glimpse, and she knew if she gave everything, they would not laugh anymore. She placed her hands back on the piano, breathing deeply, ready to show them what they never expected. The hall was still filled with scattered laughter, but the girl no longer heard it. Her small hands rested on the piano keys, and her eyes closed. She breathed in slowly, as if gathering every memory, every pain, every hope she had carried. The hunger in her stomach felt like a heavy stone, but the fire in her heart burned brighter. She pressed the first note again, and this time it came alive, rich and deep, not trembling, not weak. It was like a voice breaking free from silence. The crowd leaned forward. Some expected her to stumble, but the second note followed, then the third, and soon her fingers moved with a rhythm that was both graceful and strong. The noise of chatter slowly died down, replaced by the flow of music that filled the room. Her hands flew across the keys faster and faster, each sound sharper, clearer, carrying something that none of them expected. The laughter faded into silence. A woman who had been ready to mock stopped with her glass halfway to her lips. Her eyes widened as she listened. A young man near the back lowered his phone, forgetting to record for a moment. His mouth hung open as the music wrapped around him. Even the waiter who had mocked her earlier stopped moving. His tray frozen in his hands, the notes rose higher, then fell softly like whispers of pain. The music carried hunger, the cold nights she had slept without a blanket, the shame of being laughed at, the loneliness of walking streets with no one to care. But it also carried hope, the dream of a better tomorrow, the memory of her mother's voice telling her she was special. That music was a gift. Every chord was like a cry, every melody like a secret she was finally sharing with the world. Her body swayed with the music. Her eyes still closed, she forgot the bread, forgot the cruel words. She was no longer the hungry girl in torn clothes. She was a musician, pouring her soul into the keys. The piano responded to her like an old friend, each note glowing, filling the golden hall with something powerful, something pure. The crowd did not know when their smirks disappeared. The hall that was once full of mockery now felt heavy with silence. A child who had laughed at her earlier now tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "She plays like magic." The mother did not answer. Her eyes were wet with tears she did not want anyone to see. At the corner, the man in the dark suit sat straighter, his smirk gone. His glass rested on the table untouched. He watched her hands move across the piano, faster and faster, and for the first time that night, he had nothing to say. The girl was no longer their entertainment. She was commanding them, bending the room to her song. Her fingers hit the keys with force, then softened, then soared again. The music rose and fell like waves, filling every corner, every ear. Every note seemed to touch something hidden inside the listeners. One woman covered her mouth. Her chest shaking, another man leaned forward, whispering, "This is impossible." But no one answered him. They were all too busy listening. The hall became a different place. The chandeliers sparkled. The tables full of food stood forgotten. No one ate. No one drank. Everyone's eyes stayed on the thin girl at the piano, the same girl they had laughed at, mocked, insulted, and now they could not look away. Tears rolled down the girl's cheeks, not from sadness but from release. She had kept her pain locked inside for so long. Now it was flowing out. Carried by every sound, she played faster, her hands almost a blur, then softer, her touch delicate, gentle. The music shifted from sorrow to strength, from despair to hope and back again. Her song was not just music, it was her life story. A story told without words. Even the waiter stopped moving. Dishes grew cold, glasses stood untouched. It was as if time itself had paused, holding its breath to listen. A small sigh escaped from someone in the front row. A murmur of disbelief spread, but no one dared to speak louder. They were afraid to break the spell. The man in the dark suit finally leaned back, his face unreadable. But his eyes betrayed something, respect, maybe even shame. He had expected a joke, but now he sat like everyone else, caught in the storm of her music. The girl's fingers danced over the piano one last time, ending in a sharp, beautiful chord that rang through the hall like a bell. For a moment there was nothing but silence, a silence so deep that even the sound of breathing felt loud. The girl opened her eyes slowly, her chest rising and falling. She looked at the crowd, unsure of what would come next. Would they laugh again? Would they push her out? She swallowed, waiting. The silence stretched. Long and heavy, no one knew what to say. They had laughed at her, but now they were stunned. Their eyes followed her every move, their hearts still caught in the music. And though no one spoke yet, the truth was already clear. Something inside the hall had changed forever. The last note of her song still echoed in the air, and the hall was frozen in silence. The girl sat with her hands resting gently on the piano keys. Afraid to lift her eyes, she could feel the weight of their stares. Waiting for the cruel laughter to return, waiting for someone to push her away, but the sound did not come. Instead, the silence stretched, thick and heavy, like the moment before rain. Slowly, one of the waiters lowered his tray to the table, his mouth slightly open. He had been ready to laugh, to mock her again, but the music had stolen the words from his lips. Around the room, people exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected a joke, a failure, something to feed their pride. Instead, they had been struck by something they did not understand. The girl pressed another soft key, not sure why. Maybe because she wanted to keep the silence alive. And the note floated gently, pulling them back into her spell. This time no one laughed, no one clapped in mockery. All eyes stayed locked on her as if she had suddenly become the center of the universe. The woman in the golden dress who had laughed the loudest earlier touched her pearls with shaky fingers. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say something, but she could not. Beside her, her friend leaned forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. Where did she learn this? She whispered. But the words were swallowed by the silence of the hall. The music grew again, not as wild as before, but steady, confident. Her fingers moved with a grace that seemed impossible for a girl in torn clothes. Every note carried a story, a truth, something too real to ignore. The hall that once felt proud and arrogant was now humbled, captured by the invisible strings of her song. The chandeliers above sparkled like stars, reflecting light on her hair. The black surface of the piano gleamed under her moving hands. It looked as if she belonged there, as if the piano had been waiting for her all along. The room that had once mocked her now felt like a temple, and she was the one leading them into silence. Some guests covered their mouths, hiding the emotions on their faces. A man in the front row pressed his fist against his lips, trying to stop the tears rising in his eyes. He had come for wine and laughter, but he was given something else, something deep, something that touched a wound he thought long forgotten. Even the waiters who had once smirked at her stood still, not daring to interrupt. Plates grew cold, glasses of wine untouched. The sound of her music was stronger than hunger, stronger than pride. No one could pull themselves away. The girl, lost in the world of her own melody, no longer cared about the bread on the table. She no longer thought of the insults or the cruel stares. Her heart was free, pouring out everything she had ever held inside. She was not playing to survive anymore. She was playing because the piano was her voice, and for the first time, someone was finally listening at the back. The child who had pointed and laughed at her now sat quietly on his chair. His wide eyes followed every move of her fingers. He leaned against his mother and whispered, "She's beautiful." The mother wiped her tears quickly, pretending they were not there. The man in the dark suit, who had mocked her the loudest, leaned back in his chair, but his face had changed. His smirk was gone, replaced with something he could not hide, respect, maybe even guilt. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his jaw tight as if fighting an emotion he did not want to show. The music climbed higher, then fell, then rose again, like the voice of someone telling a story of pain and hope. The hall was no longer a place of wealth and arrogance. It had become a place of confession. Each person heard something different in her music. One heard the sorrow of his youth, another felt the loneliness of his past. Another remembered a dream they had given up long ago. The girl opened her eyes now, and her tears sparkled in the golden light. But her hands did not stop. They moved faster, stronger, her music filling every corner of the room. Her small body seemed too fragile for such power, but the piano obeyed her like an old friend. One woman dropped her napkin without realizing. Another man forgot to drink his wine. The whole hall was caught, helpless under her spell. The same crowd that had mocked her now sat humbled, trembling inside, their hearts shaken by a girl they had almost pushed away. Her music slowed, softer now, gentle, delicate, as if she was whispering to each of them. The sound was no longer a storm, but a tender hand on a wounded soul. The room exhaled together, as if they had all been holding their breath. When the last note faded once more, the silence returned. But it was no longer the silence of mockery. It was the silence of awe, the silence that follows truth. The girl sat still, her fingers resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling. She dared not look up. But she could feel it. She had changed them. The room was not the same anymore, and neither was she. The hall remained still after her music. No one dared to move. The people who had once laughed now sat quietly, their hearts strangely heavy. The girl looked down at the piano keys, afraid to meet their eyes. She thought they might shout at her again, or chase her away. But then a soft sound broke the silence. It was the sound of someone crying. At first it was small, just a muffled sob hidden behind a handkerchief. A woman sitting near the front had tears rolling down her cheeks. She tried to wipe them quickly, ashamed to be seen weeping in public. But the tears would not stop. Her husband turned to her in surprise, but his own throat felt tight as he listened to the echo of the music still inside him. More people began to shift in their seats. A young man recording the girl lowered his phone, his hand trembling. "This is not just music," he whispered, his voice unsteady. "This is her soul." His friend beside him nodded silently, unable to speak. The laughter that had once filled the hall now seemed like a distant memory, something shameful, something cruel. The girl still did not lift her head. She could not see the tears, but she could feel the change in the room. The heavy silence was no longer against her, it was for her. She touched the keys again, softly, gently. letting another stream of notes flow out. This time it was not the storm of her pain, but the tender song of her hope. The music filled the air like a prayer, and people who had never believed in anything greater than themselves suddenly felt small. The old woman who had first mocked her covered her mouth. Her shoulders shaking, she remembered her childhood, the days when her family was poor, when she herself had begged for food. The music pulled out memories she had buried long ago, and she felt ashamed of her cruel laughter. A man in a fine coat gripped the table with his fists. His face was red not from anger, but from trying to hold back tears he did not want anyone to see. The girl's fingers danced across the piano, her tears dripping silently onto the keys. She was not playing to impress them. She was playing because she needed to, because it was the only way to release the weight inside her. The sound grew louder, stronger, then softer again, like a heartbeat, steady and alive. Each person in the room felt it differently. Some heard regret, some heard love, some heard the pain of their own mistakes. Even the children who had laughed at her earlier now sat quietly, staring at her with wide eyes. One small boy whispered to his mother, "She's not poor. She's special." His mother kissed his head and wiped her own tears quickly, not wanting him to see her cry. The man in the dark suit sat stiffly in his chair. His face was pale, his smirk had long disappeared. He had mocked her, encouraged others to laugh, but now he could not meet her eyes. He looked down at his hands, ashamed. The sound of her music dug into him like a knife, reminding him of all the times he had chosen cruelty instead of kindness, and for the first time he wished he could take it back. The music swelled again, filling the golden hall like sunlight breaking through clouds. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. A woman near the back cried openly now, her shoulders shaking as she clutched her scarf. A young man beside her reached out and held her hand. Though they were strangers, in that moment the music connected them all, breaking down the walls of pride and wealth that usually stood between them. The girl's heart pounded in her chest. Her stomach was still empty, but her soul was overflowing. She no longer cared about the bread. She no longer feared their laughter. For the first time, she realized that her gift was greater than her hunger, greater than her pain. She was touching them, changing them not with words, but with something they could not escape. Truth. Her final notes in the melody fell like soft raindrops, gentle and warm. The tears in the crowd grew heavier. People wiped their faces quickly, embarrassed, but it was too late. Everyone could see it. The mighty hall, full of pride and arrogance, had been broken by the music of a hungry girl. When the last note faded, the silence returned. But it was different this time. It was not empty, it was full, it was heavy with emotion. The girl slowly lifted her head, her eyes red with tears for the first time. She dared to look at them, and what she saw stunned her. Dozens of faces were wet with tears. Men and women who had mocked her now looked at her with awe. Some looked away, unable to meet her gaze, ashamed of how they had treated her. Others leaned forward, their lips parted, as if they wanted to say something but had no words. The girl's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected this, she had only asked for bread, but instead she had moved hearts. The hall was no longer the same. It was no longer a place of cruel laughter. It had become a place of truth, a place where pain and beauty had collided. The girl sat trembling, unsure of what would happen next. But she knew one thing for certain. Her music had reached them, and they could never forget it. The final note still hung in the air like a whisper that refused to leave. The girl's fingers rested on the keys. Her chest rising and falling, her hands trembled, and her eyes lowered once again. She did not know what they would do. She expected the laughter to return, maybe the insults, maybe the order to get out. Her heart raced, waiting for the sound of cruelty she had grown used to all her life. But the hall remained silent, so silent that even the ticking of the clock on the far wall seemed loud. The people stared at her, their faces frozen between shock and wonder. No one reached for their food. No one lifted a glass, they just sat there, caught in a moment none of them could explain. The girl shifted nervously on the bench, ready to stand and run. Then suddenly, a sound broke the silence, not laughter, not a cruel word, but the sharp clap of hands. One man in the back began to applaud, slowly at first. His palms hit together in steady beats, his eyes shone as he looked at her. And then another joined him, then another, until the hall filled with the sound of clapping. The applause grew louder, stronger, rolling through the hall like thunder. People stood from their chairs, clapping and cheering. Some even whistled. The same people who had mocked her only minutes ago were now on their feet, honoring her. The girl's eyes widened in shock. She had never seen anything like it. She had only hoped for bread, but here they were, clapping for her as if she was the most important person in the room. The waiter who had once told her to leave now placed his tray down and clapped the hardest. His eyes wet with tears, he whispered, "Forgive me," though she could not hear. A woman pressed her hands together and bowed her head, whispering prayers under her breath. Her golden necklace shone under the light, but she looked smaller than before, humbled by the music of a girl in torn clothes. The girl's lips parted, her voice shaky. I just wanted bread," she whispered. Though the applause drowned her words, her stomach twisted with hunger, but her heart was filled with something new. The sound of their clapping washed over her, warming her like a blanket. The man in the dark suit, the one who had started the mockery, stood slowly from his chair. His eyes were wet, though he tried to hide it. He pressed his hands together and clapped too. His face was pale with shame, but also full of something he had not felt in years. Respect. For the first time he bowed his head slightly toward her. As if acknowledging her victory over him, the crowd cheered again, louder. Some shouted words of praise. "Bravo," one man cried. "Play again," another shouted. A woman reached into her purse and pulled out money, placing it on the edge of the stage. Soon others followed, dropping coins, notes, even jewelry near her feet. They wanted to give her more than bread. They wanted to give her back the dignity they had stolen. The girl's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head, not understanding why they were being kind now. Her small hands gripped the piano tightly. She felt dizzy, almost afraid that if she moved, everything would disappear like a dream. The applause went on, refusing to stop. The hall shook with the sound. People who had never agreed on anything before now stood together, united by her music. Even the children clapped their tiny hands, smiling at her with wide eyes. Their laughter now was not cruel but pure, filled with admiration. The girl looked at the bread basket still sitting on the table. Untouched, she had come only for that, a single piece of bread to ease her hunger. But now she realized something. Her music had given her far more than food. It had given her a place in their hearts, a respect she never imagined she could earn. Her tears spilled freely now. She stood slowly, her thin figure shaking. She bowed her head, her voice too soft to rise above the cheers. But she whispered anyway. "Thank you." The hall erupted once more, as if they had heard her. The sound of applause rained down on her like endless waves. The chandeliers glittered above, the tables shone with untouched feasts. But no one cared about food or wine anymore. They cared only about the girl who had turned their laughter into shame, their pride into tears, and their silence into thunderous applause. For a brief moment she felt like she belonged there, not as a beggar, not as someone pitied, but as someone worthy, someone important. And though her stomach still ached with hunger, her soul felt full for the first time in her life. The crowd did not want her to leave. They shouted for more, begged her to play again. Some leaned forward, holding out bread, fruit, and coins, desperate to give her something in return, but she only stood there. Stunned, her heart pounding, she thought to herself, maybe the piano had always been her true voice. Maybe this was why she had been given the gift. Not to beg, not to be mocked, but to show the world that even the weakest, the hungriest, the poorest soul could still hold beauty inside. The applause slowly softened, but it did not stop completely. People whispered to each other, some calling her a genius, some saying she must be trained, some saying they would never forget this night. And though she was just a poor girl in torn clothes, for that moment she was more than all of them. She was a musician who had stolen their hearts. The applause still shook the hall, echoing against the golden walls. The girl stood frozen in front of the piano, her small body trembling. She had never felt so many eyes on her, not with hate this time, not with laughter, but with something different, something she could not yet understand. The tears on her cheeks dried slowly, leaving faint marks on her skin. She pressed her hand to her chest, her heart beating so fast it felt like it might break. Then it happened. The waiter who had first mocked her stepped forward. His hands shook as he held out a plate. On it sat a loaf of warm bread fresh from the kitchen. The smell reached her nose, soft and sweet. Her eyes widened. She had dreamed of this moment for days, but it felt too good to be real. He placed the plate on the piano and whispered so only she could hear. "Forgive me, little one, please eat." The girl's lips parted, but no words came. She stared at the bread as if it were a miracle. She reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the crust, still warm, still soft. She pulled it close and took a bite. Her body shivered at the taste, her eyes filled with tears again. This was not just food, it was dignity returned. The crowd erupted again, this time with cheers instead of clapping. People shouted to bring her more. Fruit, wine, meat, bring everything, one man cried. Soon the tables were alive, hands passing plates, baskets, even bottles toward the piano. The girl looked around in disbelief as the food piled before her. She had come for one piece of bread, and now the tables of the wealthy bent toward her in offering. A woman in a silk dress stepped forward with a velvet purse. She emptied it at the girl's feet, coins and jewels scattering across the stage. The girl gasped, stepping back in fear. She had never seen so much wealth in her life. The woman took her hand gently and said, "This is not enough for what you gave us tonight." Her voice cracked, her eyes red from crying. More people followed. Men placed money on the piano. Women removed rings from their fingers and placed them beside the bread. One man offered his coat, fine and heavy, telling her she should never be cold again. She shook her head, overwhelmed, her tears falling harder now. She wanted to say she didn't need it. She only wanted bread, but they refused to stop. Children ran up with small offerings of their own. A little girl placed a flower crown she had been wearing on the piano, smiling shyly. "For you," she whispered. The hungry girl bent down, her voice shaking as she said, "Thank you." She placed the crown gently on her head, her hair messy but glowing now under the chandeliers. At the corner of the room, the man in the dark suit stood still, his chest heavy with shame. He had been the cruelest, yet even he could not hold back anymore. He walked toward her, slowly, his footsteps heavy. The hall grew quiet as people watched. He stopped in front of the piano and bowed his head low. His voice was hoarse. "I was wrong. I am sorry." He placed a gold watch on the piano and stepped back. His hands shook as he covered his face. The girl looked at all the gifts, the food, the money, the clothes. She could hardly breathe. It was too much, far too much. Her stomach was full after only a few bites of bread, but her soul was filled in a way she had never imagined. She realized then that her music had given her more than she asked for. Her music had made even the proudest people bend, even the cruelest turn soft. She lifted her hands once more to the piano. The crowd grew silent again, expecting another song. Instead, she pressed a single soft note, then whispered, "Thank you." Her voice carried through the room like another melody, gentle and pure. People bowed their heads, some pressing their hands together as if in prayer. The night that had begun with hunger and humiliation had turned into something she could not have dreamed. She had walked in asking for a piece of bread, and now she stood with more than she could ever carry. But what mattered most was not the bread, not the money, not the gifts. What mattered was that for the first time in her life, they saw her. They did not see a beggar anymore. They saw a musician, they saw a soul, they saw a girl who had changed them. The applause began again, softer this time, not mocking, not thunderous, but warm and gentle, like a promise. It was no longer about entertainment. It was respect. The girl bowed her head, her tears falling onto the piano keys, and for the first time in her life, she felt she was not invisible, not forgotten. She was someone. The hall was still glowing with applause and whispers, but the girl could not believe what had just happened. Her stomach was no longer empty, her heart was no longer heavy, and the cruel laughter that had once filled the room was now replaced by respect and awe. She looked around at the faces that had once mocked her, now shining with tears and admiration. It was almost too much to take in. A man at the back raised his phone and whispered, "This must be shared." He had recorded her entire performance, and without waiting, he sent it out to the world. Others did the same. Some uploaded the video to social platforms. Some shared it with friends, and within minutes the story of the hungry girl who played for bread began to spread. Outside the hall, people started to gather, drawn by the sound of music that had spilled through the open doors. They asked each other what was happening inside, and soon the whispers traveled through the streets. A starving girl played the piano like no one has ever heard. The city that had ignored her for years now buzzed with her name. Inside, the girl still stood trembling beside the piano. She had not touched the gifts piled at her feet. She did not understand why strangers would give her so much. She only knew that her music had opened something in their hearts. A woman stepped forward, touching her shoulder softly. "Child, you are more than you know," she said, her voice trembling. The girl looked up, her tears shining, and for the first time, she smiled without fear. The man in the dark suit, who had bowed before her earlier, now stood at the edge of the crowd, watching silently. He felt smaller than he ever had, ashamed of his cruelty. But even he was moved by the truth that she had revealed. In his heart, he knew he would never forget this night. The girl had taken away his pride with nothing but her music, and he felt strangely grateful. The applause slowly faded, but the respect remained. People began to leave, but not before pressing gifts into her hands, bread wrapped in cloth, coins, small notes of thanks scribbled on napkins. They left with their heads bowed, whispering about her as if she were a miracle. The girl sat at the piano staring at her hands. She had come for food, but she was leaving with something she never expected, a place in their memory. Days passed, and the video of her performance traveled far beyond the walls of that hall. Millions watched the thin girl in torn clothes play as if the piano were her soul. People cried as they listened. People wrote about her. Some called her the girl who played hunger into hope. Some called her the voice of the forgotten. The world was stunned. Offers began to come. Music schools reached out, asking her to join. Philanthropists sent money to help her family. Even famous musicians spoke about her, saying they had never heard such raw beauty. The girl who had once been invisible now had the eyes of the world on her. And through it all, she stayed the same. Humble, quiet, still remembering the night she asked for a piece of bread. Her life began to change. Her mother received medicine. Her little brother finally had enough to eat. They lived in a small but safe home now, and the piano was no longer just a dream. It was her companion, her voice, her future. The girl practiced every day, not to impress the world, but to honor the gift she had been given. She never forgot that hall, though. She never forgot the faces that mocked her, or the way their laughter turned to tears. She remembered how music had broken through their walls, and she carried that lesson with her forever. She knew her story was no longer just about hunger. It was about hope. It was about how beauty could come from the most broken places, and so when she played again on bigger stages under brighter lights, she always closed her eyes and remembered that night. She remembered the hunger, the shame, the laughter, and then the silence, the tears, the applause. She remembered how everything had changed because she had dared to play. The world listened now, but in her heart she played not for fame, not for riches. She played for the little girl who once stood at the door trembling, asking for bread. She played for the forgotten children still wandering the streets. She played for every soul who had ever been mocked, every voice that had ever been silenced, and wherever her music went, it carried the same truth. That dignity does not come from wealth, that beauty does not come from clothes or power, but from the courage to share what is inside. The hungry girl had found her voice, and through her voice, she had found her place in the world. The night she first asked, "Can I play for a piece of bread?" had become the night that changed everything. And though bread had filled her stomach, it was music that had filled her soul. Her song had touched hearts, moved strangers to tears, and reminded the world that even the smallest voice could create the loudest change.